Imagine silence. Not the peaceful, lulling silence of a village deep in the night, but a different kind, a dense, viscous, deafening silence that follows the thunder of an apocalypse. June 1940. Somewhere in the swamps of northern France, a few dozen miles south of what was recently the front line, but was now simply enemy territory, a vast, unmarked grave for thousands just like them. Sergeant Arthur Finch sat with his back against the slick, algae-covered trunk of an old willow, staring at the stars. They were indifferent, cold, exactly as he had seen them back home in Sussex while fixing the shed roof. He remembered that evening in detail. The smell of fresh wood shavings, the warm breeze carrying the scent of roses from his wife Emily's garden, and her laughter drifting from the open kitchen window. Now that laughter seemed like a sound from another universe, from a life that belonged to another man. Here, under this alien, hostile sky, the starlight felt like a sophisticated mockery. It offered no hope, no comfort, only accentuating the infinite, all-consuming cosmic loneliness. There had been 5 of them. Now there were 3 left who could move and think coherently, although Finch wasn't so sure about the coherently part anymore. The other 2 were more like shadows, ghosts clinging to life with their last ounce of strength, like drowning men to a piece of wreckage in a frozen ocean. The damp air, smelling of mire, decay, and despair, seeped under his wet, torn uniform, making his body tremble with a ceaseless chill. For nights now they hadn't lit a fire, afraid to betray themselves with even the smallest wisp of smoke, the faintest flicker of flame. The cold had become their constant companion, as inescapable as hunger and despair. It had crawled under their skin and settled deep in their bones, and it seemed impossible to ever drive it out. Slowly, with effort, as if his neck vertebrae had rusted, Finch turned his head. To his left, curled into a tight tense ball, Corporal Thomas Glass, whom everyone just called Tommy, was trying to sleep. Even in sleep, his face was a mask of suffering. Behind his cracked spectacles, his eyelids twitched, as if he were still drawing his endless maps and diagrams in his inflamed, feverish brain. He muttered something, numbers, formulas, fragments of calculations. His mind, his greatest weapon, had now become his torture, giving him no rest. To his right, leaning on his rifle, stood Lance Corporal Owen Davis on watch, a Welshman with the eyes of an old wise dog that had seen too many deaths and births. He hadn't slept for 2 days, yet his posture showed not a hint of fatigue, only the stone-like stillness of an ancient dolmen. He stared into the darkness, but Finch knew. Owen saw more than just swaying reeds and the phosphorescent lights of marsh gas. He saw ghosts, the ones they had left behind, and the one who now remained forever on their island. A little further away, covered by the last intact but perpetually damp blanket, lay Reginald Carter and Billy Hobbs. Or rather, that's how it used to be. Now only Reg was there. He moaned in his sleep, his body racked with fever from a wound in his leg, which was already turning black at the edges and emitting a sweet, nauseating smell. And the spot where Billy, just a boy, 19-year-old, the kid, had been, was empty. It had been empty for weeks, but Finch still saw him there, saw him breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his chest pierced by shrapnel, each breath an agony. He saw his smile, faint and apologetic, and heard his last words. Those words now echoed in Finch's head constantly, drowning out all other sounds. He looked at his hands, dirty, covered in scabs and old scratches, with dirt ingrained under broken nails. With these hands he had gently stroked his daughter's hair. With these hands he had held blueprints in a slide rule. With these hands he had placed explosives under the bridge supports. With these hands he had forcefully turned the handle of the detonator. These hands had performed a miracle, possibly saving tens of thousands of lives, and these same hands had signed all their death warrants. He closed his eyes and saw it again. The bridge. An elegant stone bridge spanning the murky, slow waters of the canal. The last artery connecting their retreating, bleeding units with the ghostly hope of salvation at Dunkirk. And he, Arthur Finch, Sergeant of the Royal Engineers, had severed that artery with surgical precision. They were heroes. For 5 minutes. For those 5 minutes of deafening, intoxicating euphoria, when the earth shuddered and the stone piers of the bridge, like weary, ancient beasts, collapsed into the water, sending a column of spray, dust, and centuries of history into the sky. And then came that silence. And in that silence, they heard the sound of the last British trucks driving away. They were alone, forgotten, written off. Grains of sand swept by the hurricane of history into a roadside ditch. Their feat was magnificent and utterly anonymous. In the staff reports, if any existed, Their unit was likely already listed under missing in action while performing a combat mission. Missing in action. It sounded so mundane, so wrong, so false. They weren't missing. They were here, in the very heart of enemy territory, in a hell of their own making. And now their only mission was not to save an army, but simply to survive until dawn. To take one more breath without making a rasping sound that might attract attention. How had they, the best sappers in their battalion, engineers meant to build and create, turned into hunted, half-mad animals hiding in the swamps? How had their greatest triumph become their most terrible curse? To understand this, to grasp the full depth of their fate's irony, the monstrous injustice of this oblivion, one must go back 3 weeks. To that last day of May 1940, when they were still soldiers, not ghosts, when they still believed in orders and that the word victory still held some meaning for them. May 29th, 1940. The air was thick and warm, smelling of sun-baked dust, metal heated to its limit, and blooming rapeseed, whose cloyingly sweet, almost nauseating aroma seemed to permeate everything, mixing with the acrid, sour smell of gunpowder. It was a strange, unnatural cocktail of the sense of peace and war, enough to drive a man mad. Life and death were entwined within it in one tight, suffocating knot. Sergeant Finch's unit rode in the back of a rattling Bedford truck, bouncing on every pothole of the ruined French road, instinctively clutching the rough wooden sides. They were exhausted beyond measure, having not slept for nearly 3 days, covered in a layer of mud and soot that made their uniforms indistinguishable from the color of the earth. They barely spoke, lost in a heavy, viscous torpor. For them, the war in recent days had become an endless, senseless series of orders, retreats, short, vicious skirmishes, and more retreats. The British Expeditionary Force was rolling back toward the coast like a huge, mortally wounded turtle, leaving behind burnt villages, the skeletons of wrecked equipment, and a thin, barely visible thread of hope that the sea would take them and save them. Sergeant Arthur Finch, a 32-year-old man with a face that seemed carved from gray granite, looked not at the road, but at his men. He knew each of them better than a brother. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, their hidden fears. There was Corporal Tommy Glass, bespectacled, looking more like a schoolteacher or a librarian than a soldier. He sat with a worn map spread on his knees, muttering to himself, tracing lines with the tip of a chemical pencil. In his head, the world consisted of angles, vectors, and formulas. His weapons were not a rifle and grenades, but a slide rule and a flawless knowledge of trigonometry. He could calculate the charge to blow up anything, from a barn to a railway bridge, with gram-perfect accuracy accounting for material resistance and current strength. He was the brain of their small unit, and Finch valued him more than any machine gun crew. Next to him, sprawled out with one leg casually thrown over the other, sat Private Reginald Reg Carter, the oldest and most experienced of them, a veteran of some colonial wars in dusty corners of the empire. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles and small scars, like an old map, and his cynical, faded eyes held a permanent dissatisfaction with everything. The weather, the food, the officers, the French, the Germans, and it seemed God himself. He grumbled constantly. It was his way of communicating with the world, but he knew his job inside and out. No one was better than Reg with a Bickford fuse and temperamental detonators. Opposite him, staring into the distance with an unseeing gaze, sat Lance Corporal Owen Davis, a Welshman, a former miner from the Rhondda Valley. He was as silent as the rocks of his native Wales and just as reliable. His hands, enormous, calloused, with ingrained coal dust that no war could wash away, could just as easily place a multi-kilogram charge as they could carve a tiny, exquisite wooden bird. They said he could feel the stress in stone and metal as if it were a living thing and could predict a cave-in in a mine or a weak spot in a bridge's structure. And finally, Billy Hobbs, the kid Billy. He had just turned 19 and the youthful blush had not yet faded from his cheeks, now hidden under a layer of road dust. He looked at everything with wide, naive eyes full of a mixture of fear and puppyish excitement. For him, the war was still a great, terrifying adventure from the books he had read in school. He idolized Finch and tried to imitate him in everything, from the way he held his rifle to the way he rolled a cigarette, which he did with a touchingly clumsy, childlike manner. Finch shifted his gaze back to the road. They were the last. Behind them, a few miles away, a low, deep rumble could be heard, vibrating through the earth. It wasn't tanks. It was the steamroller of history itself, slowly but relentlessly grinding everything in its path. Their task was simple and monstrous at the same time, to blow up the bridge, the last intact bridge over the La Bassée Canal. If they succeeded, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, The Ghost Division would be stopped by the water obstacle and bogged down for at least a few hours, and every hour now was worth its weight in gold. Every hour meant another destroyer or fishing trawler departing from the beaches of Dunkirk. It meant another few hundred or thousand lives saved. Their unit was the single grain of sand that was supposed to get into the well-oiled mechanism of the German blitzkrieg and jam it, if only for a moment. The cost of that grain of sand interested no one. The truck braked sharply, throwing them forward. They had arrived. Ahead, in a gap between weeping willows, it appeared. The bridge, old stone with 3 elegant moss-covered arches. It possessed the calm, self-assured beauty of things that have stood for centuries and witnessed generations come and go, and they were about to destroy it. The lieutenant who met them was young, nervous, his lip twitching with a tic. "Thank God you're here, Sergeant," he said, not looking Finch in the eye. "They're on their way. Recon reported the lead column is 5 miles out. You have no more than an hour, maybe less." Finch nodded without a word. He walked to the edge of the bank and looked at the bridge, appraisingly, like a surgeon looking at a patient before a complex operation. Owen Davis stood beside him. "She's a tough old girl," the Welshman said quietly, stroking the stubble on his chin. "Solid masonry. Piers are set deep." "This will take some work, Sergeant." Tommy Glass was already unfolding his blueprints on the truck's hood, quickly calculating something and muttering to himself. "Piers A and C, Sergeant," he reported a minute later, tapping the diagram with his pencil. "We don't touch the central arch, that's unnecessary work. Borehole charge method, 3 charges on each. About 45 kilograms, around 100 pounds, of plastic explosive per charge. That'll be enough to make it fold like a house of cards." Finch turned around. The last of the infantrymen were already running across the bridge to their side, taking up defensive positions at hastily dug emplacements. There were no more than a platoon of them, too few. "Reg, Billy, get the crates. Owen, you're with me on the drills. Tommy, you're in charge of the wires and the detonator." He gave his commands in a steady, calm voice that betrayed no hint of doubt. "Work fast. We have very little time." At that moment, he did not yet know how prophetic those words would be. He did not know that this bridge would become a border not only between 2 armies, but between their past lives and the nightmare that awaited them. He looked at its gray, warm-to-the-touch stones and felt nothing in his soul but cold, detached professional resolve. He was an engineer, and he had a job to do. The roar began suddenly, without warning. First, a distant, barely perceptible hum, like an angry hornet, which quickly grew into a deafening, eardrum-shattering scream of diving bombers. Stukas! The lookout's cry was drowned out by the wail of sirens the Germans deliberately fitted to their planes to sow panic. The sound was a psychological weapon. It burrowed into the brain, paralyzing the will and forcing an instinctive dive for cover. The ground heaved from nearby explosions. Fountains of black mud and murky water shot up from the canal, drenching them in an icy shower. Finch, pressed against a massive stone pier of the bridge, felt the vibrations from the blasts run through his entire body, rattling his teeth. Fine stone dust and grit rained down from above, getting into his eyes and nose. They had only managed to place half the charges. Reg Carter, spewing curses through clenched teeth, fumbled with the wiring at the second pier, his usually nimble fingers now seeming clumsy. Billy Hobbs, huddled in a small depression in the ground, covered his head with his arms, his body trembling in small, uncontrollable shudders. "Work!" Finch roared, his voice cracking over the din. "Ignore it! It's just noise." But how could you ignore it when death was screaming and circling right overhead, choosing its next victim? One of the bombs hit the Bedford directly. The truck, their only link to the world, their only way back, disintegrated with a deafening crack. Burning petrol spilled onto the road, turning it into a river of fire that billowed thick black smoke. But there was no time to think about that. The raid ended as suddenly as it had begun, and in the ringing, concussed silence that followed, they heard a new sound. The sharp, dry crackle of machine guns and rapid rifle fire. The infantry covering them had engaged the enemy. The Germans were already here, the advance units. "Sergeant, the wires!" yelled Tommy Glass, his face pale as a sheet, but resolute. "One more raid and they could be cut. We won't get a second chance." Finch understood. They no longer had time for perfect preparation, for checking every connection. They had to act now, immediately. He crawled over to Owen, who, ignoring the whistling bullets, was finishing the last borehole. "That's enough, Owen. Place the charge." "Quick!" The Welshman nodded silently, his hands moving with incredible speed and precision, as if he had 4 of them. He placed the last viscous, soap-like stick of explosive, tamped it down, and inserted the detonator. Everything was ready. All that was left was to connect the wires from all the charges into a single circuit and crawl to a safe distance. But the German fire was intensifying with every second. Bullets ricocheted off the bridge's stones with a vicious, stinging whine. One of the British machine gunners fell silent, choking on his own blood. Another cried out briefly and fell. Their cover was melting away before their eyes. "Reg, Billy, back to the ditch," Finch ordered. "Tommy, get the plunger over here!" Corporal Glass, staying so low his chin almost touched the ground, dragged the heavy wooden box with the induction exploder towards him. The final touch. Connecting 2 copper wires. Finch grabbed them. His fingers, accustomed to fine, delicate work, now felt like wooden, disobedient things. He could feel the eyes of dozens of German soldiers on him, who were already swarming the opposite bank. He could see their grey helmets, their faces contorted in a scream. In that moment, the world shrank to the 2 copper wire ends in his hands. He twisted them together. Done. "Everyone take cover," he bellowed with all his might. "Fire in the hole." They scrambled into a roadside ditch filled with filthy, stinking water. Finch placed his hand on the T-shaped handle of the detonator. He cast one last look at the bridge. Lying on it, crumpled, were the bodies of their comrades who had given their lives to buy them these precious minutes. He saw the first German soldiers, young, arrogant, step onto the bridge. They were running, confident in their swift victory. Sergeant Arthur Finch, with a force born of all his fury and will, turned the handle. For the first second, nothing happened. A second that felt like an eternity, during which he had time to think that it was all for nothing, that there was a break in the circuit somewhere. And then the ground fell away from under them. A deafening, crushing impact shook everything. It was not just the sound of an explosion. It was the roar of creation itself, tearing open to swallow a man-made thing. The stone arches of the bridge, which had stood for hundreds of years, seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and then, with a monstrous screech and groan, they began to settle, to break, to crumble into dust. Huge blocks of stone fell into the water, raising giant columns of spray and steam. The bridge was dying. It was dying in agony, and that agony was both beautiful and terrible. The German soldiers who were on it simply vanished, evaporated, erased by that monstrous force. When the smoke and dust cleared a little, they, deafened and dazed, climbed out of the ditch and saw the result of their work. Where a road had just been, there was now a gaping chasm filled with churning water and stone debris. The way was blocked. They had done it. They had followed their orders, and in that moment a wild, primal euphoria washed over them. Reg Carter, climbing out of the ditch, let out a guttural, triumphant roar. Billy Hobbs was laughing and crying at the same time, smearing mud and tears across his face. Even on the face of the imperturbable Owen Davis, something resembling a grim smile appeared. Finch got to his feet. He felt drained and yet incredibly proud. He looked at the opposite bank where the Germans were milling about in confusion. They had won. It was their small but very important victory. He turned to look at the road leading to Dunkirk. He expected to see the trucks that were supposed to pick them up, expected to see the joyful faces of his comrades. But the road was empty, utterly empty. There were no vehicles, no people. Only in the distance on the horizon a small cloud of dust was settling. The euphoria receded like the tide, leaving behind only the cold, sticky silt of horror. He looked at his men. The laughter froze on Billy's lips. Reg stopped yelling and now just stood with his mouth open. And in the ensuing silence, broken only by the crackle of the burning truck and the groans of the wounded, Arthur Finch spoke just 2 words that became their sentence. "They're gone." And in that moment, he understood. If they were to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to become their jailer, their leader, and their god. Because the old world, with its orders, regulations, and hope of rescue, had just been blown to pieces along with that damn bridge. The first night was the worst. It fell upon them like a cold, suffocating shroud, bringing not rest but realization. The realization that they were trapped. After the last embers of euphoria died down, they were overcome with despair, as heavy and bleak as the French sky, shrouded in the smoke of fires. They lay in the same ditch that had saved them from the blast. But now it felt less like a shelter and more like a freshly dug grave. The Germans on the other side periodically opened up with sporadic fire, and bullets whizzed viciously over their heads. They made no attempt to cross. They were just pinning them down, knowing they had nowhere to go, like a hunter holding a cornered animal at gunpoint. Hunger began to announce itself with a dull, gnawing ache in their stomachs. Their rations had burned up with the truck. Their canteens held only a few mouthfuls of stale, chlorine-smelling water. But worst of all was a different kind of thirst. A thirst for information, for understanding. Why had they been abandoned? Was it a mistake? A misunderstanding? Or were they considered expendable from the start? A suicide mission? A one-way ticket? These questions hung in the air, venomous and persistent, poisoning their thoughts. Reg Carter was the first to break. His cynicism, which had once been a protective mask, now turned to pure venom. "Damn it all," he hissed into the darkness, his voice full of bitterness. "They just ditched us, wrote us off like spent cartridges. And we, the idiots, were celebrating. Heroes, my arse." "Shut up, Reg," Finch said wearily. He was lying on his back, staring at the black, starless sky, trying to think. He couldn't give in to panic now. Panic was a worse enemy than any German. He had to make a plan. But what kind of plan could there be when you were in enemy territory without food, without communication, without maps, and without hope? "Am I wrong, Sergeant?" Reg pressed on. "Your precious orders, your glorious victory. What now? We die here in this stinking ditch? For what? So some RMF rats in clean uniforms can get away on their yachts and ferries?" "I said shut up." Finch's voice became steel, like the edge of a knife. He sat up and looked at Carter. In the darkness, his eyes burned with a cold, dangerous fire. "One more word, Reg, and I'll break your jaw. Understood? We don't need whining right now. We need a clear head." Reg fell silent, but his heavy, angry breathing was audible in the quiet. Finch knew that Carter was right, at least in his feelings. They had indeed been abandoned, sacrificed. But to admit it aloud meant to surrender, and he was not going to surrender. He was responsible for these men, for all four of them. For the cynic Reg, the genius Tommy, the silent Owen, and the terrified-to-death kid Billy. He looked over at Hobbs. The boy was curled up in a ball, his shoulders shaking slightly. He was crying, silently, soundlessly, like a child afraid of being punished for tears. Finch's heart clenched with a sharp pang of pity. Just yesterday, this boy had been writing a letter to his mother, full of bragging and youthful bravado, telling her how proud he was of his service and how soon they would win. What would he write to her now, if he could ever write anything again? Finch crawled over to him. "Billy," he said softly. "It's going to be all right, you hear me? We'll get out of this." Billy looked up at him, his tear-streaked eyes full of terror. "How, Sergeant? How? They're everywhere. Thousands of them." "We'll find a way," Finch said firmly, though he himself had no idea what that way might be. "We're engineers. Our job is to find solutions where there are none. Now try to get some sleep. We need our strength." He placed his heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, and Billy, calmed slightly by its weight, closed his eyes. This was the first law of their new world. A leader has no right to despair, even if it's gnawing him from the inside. On the outside, he must be a rock against which the waves of others' fear break. He returned to his spot. "Tommy," he called in a whisper, "you got the map? The one from the case?" Corporal Glass immediately stirred. Work was his salvation from fear, his only anchor in this sea of chaos. "Yes, Sergeant, it's intact. What's to the south?" "Where can we go?" Tommy took out the map and spread it on the ground. Even in near total darkness, he navigated it flawlessly, his fingers seeming to find the right lines and markings on their own. "If we move due south, in about 15 miles we hit the marshes, Sergeant. The Marais de Saint-Omer, a large forested area. We can get lost in there, hardly any roads, mostly small farms and peat bogs. Tanks can't get through." "It's the perfect place to hide and wait things out. Marshes, forest. It was a chance. A ghostly, almost suicidal chance, but a chance nonetheless." "All right," Finch nodded. "We head south then. We move out before dawn under cover of the fog. Dawn is in about 3 hours. Try to get some sleep. Owen, you have first watch. Wake me in an hour and a half." Owen nodded silently. He was already sitting, peering into the darkness, his silhouette as still as a statue. Finch lay down again. He had established a new order. He had given them a goal. It may be illusory, almost impossible, but it was a goal. It was better than lying here waiting to die in a muddy ditch. But he knew this was just the beginning. The hardest part was yet to come. They didn't just need to survive. They needed to relearn how to live in a world where all the old laws had been abolished, where their skills of destruction had to give way to skills of creation, where every rustle could mean death, and every stranger an enemy. Their small unit, their brotherhood forged in battle, now had to face its greatest test, the test of silence, hunger, and hopelessness. And it was that night, listening to the gunfire die down and the first drops of rain begin to tap on his helmet, that Finch understood their luck was running out. They had only a few more hours to breathe in this relative shelter. It seemed like it was all over, but it was then that the quiet and unassuming Corporal Tommy Glass, an engineer to his core, uttered words that were both salvation and madness. "Sergeant, what if we don't go around? What if we go straight across?" Through the canal? Tommy's idea was insane and brilliant at the same time. It was born of desperation and cold, crystal-clear engineering calculation. It wasn't a flash of insight, but the result of long, intense mental work, while the others were paralyzed by fear. "The Germans will expect us to break south along the roads or the bank," he whispered, tracing a finger on the map, which he illuminated with the dim light of a captured German flashlight covered with several layers of cloth. "They'll sweep the area, set up posts. We'll be caught on the first night, but they will never ever think that we'd go straight across the canal and then through the marshes. That's suicide for a regular infantryman." "But we're not regular infantrymen, Sergeant. We're sappers. We work with the landscape, we change it." Finch listened, and in his fatigue-addled brain, a coherent chain of logic began to form. The marshes were their only salvation, but getting to them was almost impossible. But what if... What are you suggesting, Tommy? "We build a raft out of reeds like Robinson Crusoe," grumbled Reg Carter, for whom the very idea of getting into the cold water was repulsive. "A raft is too visible," Tommy cut him off, ignoring the sarcasm. "I'm suggesting something else. Look!" He pointed to the mangled, dark silhouettes of the bridge's wreckage. "When we blew it, some of the structure collapsed onto the bank, not into the water. Steel trusses, I-beams, rebar, we can use them. Make something like an underwater bridge, or rather a ford. We lay some of the heaviest beams on the bottom at the narrowest point. I've estimated the water is chest deep there, no more. We'll cross under the cover of night, underwater. From the other side, no one will see or hear us." This was their first victory. A victory not over the enemy, but over circumstance. A victory of intellect over brute force. Tommy's idea lit a tiny spark of hope in them, which dispelled the darkness of despair. They worked all night like men possessed, with a frantic energy born on the edge of life and death. Owen Davis, the ex-miner, proved invaluable. He seemed to have an intuitive understanding of weight distribution, of how the mangled metal would behave under load. His huge hands moved and set pieces of steel that the other four could barely budge, with no apparent effort. They worked in complete oppressive silence, communicating with gestures and whispers. Every screech of metal on stone sounded as loud as a gunshot to them. Every splash of water echoed in their ears like the tolling of a bell. By dawn, as a thick white fog began to roll over the water, it was ready. An invisible ford made of steel wreckage connected the two banks. It was an ugly, absurd structure, assembled from chaos and destruction, but it was their path to salvation. Their first weapon from the ashes. They waded into the cold, murky water. It was biting, forcing them to gasp for air. They carried their rifles and remaining gear above their heads. Finch went first, testing each step, feeling for the slippery metal under the water with his feet. The water came up to his chin. A strong current tried to knock them off their feet, to drag them into the darkness. But underfoot, he felt the solid, reliable support of their creation. When they emerged on the opposite bank, soaked to the bone, frozen, shivering but alive, they felt something akin to being reborn. They had tricked the enemy. They had tricked death itself. They had left the battlefield behind and entered a new world. The world of the marshes. It greeted them inhospitably. It was an endless, dreary labyrinth of tall reeds, treacherous bogs covered in green scum, and small, overgrown lakes with black, still water. The air was heavy, humid, full of miasma and clouds of vicious, insatiable mosquitoes. There were no roads here, no landmarks. It was a place where one could vanish without a trace, simply by taking one wrong step and sinking into a bottomless mire. But for them, this place was paradise. Here, they were invisible. Here, they were safe. For the first few days, they just walked. They walked south, navigating by the sun when it was visible, and by the moss on the trees. They ate what they could find. Some bitter fibrous roots that Owen dug up, frogs they caught in the murky water, snails. It wasn't food, just a way to trick their stomachs, to silence them. But that first victory, their underwater bridge, had instilled in them a fragile but stubborn hope. It had shown them that their knowledge, their sapper skills, could be used for more than just destruction. They could create. They could build their path to survival from the wreckage of the old world. And that thought warmed them better than any fire. But they did not know that their small victory had not gone unnoticed. They had escaped the suffocating enemy encirclement, but their presence, their scent, the heat of their bodies had attracted the attention of other inhabitants of this place. Those who had been masters here long before the arrival of men. Those who were eternally hungry and knew no mercy. They began to create their empire from nothing. Their own small state within a state, lost in the vast, indifferent marshes. Finch, with his innate talent for organization and planning, understood that without a strict system, they would perish. Simply wandering through the bog, hoping for luck, was a path to nowhere. They needed a home, and they found one. It was a small, heavily wooded island of solid ground in the middle of the fens, which Tommy had found on his map as a nameless green patch. It was almost impossible to reach. One had to know the single, barely visible path that snaked between the mires, but that was precisely what made it the perfect sanctuary. They spent several days building a shelter, not just a hut, but a proper dugout, using their entrenching tools and knives. They dug it into the slope of a small hill, reinforced the walls with young tree trunks, and covered the roof with a thick layer of turf and moss, camouflaging it so well that from a few paces away, it blended completely with the landscape. This was their fortress, their Noah's Ark in the midst of a hostile, primeval world. Finch established a rigid, almost military routine: reveille at dawn, 2 hours for fortifying the camp and gathering firewood. Then the group split up for their tasks. Owen and Billy were in charge of hunting and fishing. The Welshman, who had grown up in a village, proved to be an unsurpassed tracker. He taught them how to set silent snares for small game, how to make fishing rods and spears from willow branches. Their diet became incomparably richer: a scrawny marsh bird, a few slimy, mud-smelling fish, and once they even managed to catch a hare, which became a true feast they would remember for the rest of their lives. Tommy Glass became their cartographer and strategist. Every day he went out on reconnaissance, risking his life to explore the surroundings, and meticulously plotted safe paths, sources of drinking water, and places where edible plants or mushrooms could be found on his map. His map became their sacred text, their greatest treasure, the key to their survival. Reg Carter, ever grumbling, was put in charge of camp security. His cynicism and innate distrust of everything proved to be invaluable here. With diabolical ingenuity, he set up clever tripwire alarms around the island's perimeter made from branches, tin cans, and string, which could warn them of an approaching stranger, be it man or beast. Finch himself was the brain, the ruler of their small empire. He allocated resources, settled disputes, maintained iron discipline. He introduced the main law of their new society: everything acquired was communal. Everyone received an equal share, regardless of their contribution. This was not a democracy. It was a dictatorship founded on a single goal: survival. And this system worked. It gave them more than just food and security. It gave them something far more important: purpose. Each of them felt needed, an indispensable cog in this complex survival machine. Their empire of mud and branches gave them psychological stability, saving them from the madness of loneliness and despair. They had become a unit again, a single organism fighting for its life. They even began to allow themselves small pleasures. In the evenings, when the fog thickened over the marsh, they would light a tiny, almost smokeless fire inside the dugout and talk. Owen would carve figures from wood, and in his hands, exact replicas of the birds they saw during the day would be born. Billy would tell funny stories from his pre-war life on the farm. Even Reg would sometimes thaw and spin old, tired soldiers' tales. In those moments, they almost forgot where they were. They almost felt at home. Their life settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm. They had adapted. They were surviving. But the more solid their little civilization became, the more acute the contrast with the chaos raging beyond its borders. They were safe, but they were in a prison. And not everyone was willing to live by the laws of this new world. In the soul of one of them, in its darkest corner, a rebellion began to brew. A rebellion against order, against common sense. A rebellion born of fear and a false, deadly hope. The rebellion began not with a shout, but a whisper. Reg Carter, whose perpetual gloom seemed only to have deepened with the monotonous and arduous camp life, began his subversive, poisonous work. He would find moments when Billy Hobbs was alone and, in a soft, deceptively sympathetic voice, sow seeds of doubt in his young, impressionable mind. "Look at us, kid," he would hiss as they cleaned fish by the stream. "We've turned into savages, living in a hole like badgers, eating scraps. And for what? Finch feeds us fairy tales about safety. I'll tell you what this really is. It's a slow, agonizing death. We're going to rot here, and no one will even remember us. At first, Billy brushed it off. His faith in the sergeant was almost religious. But Reg's words, like dripping water, wore away the stone of his confidence. But out there on the coast, Carter continued, are our boys. Maybe the evacuation is still going on. Maybe there are partisans. There's life, a fight, a chance. What's here? A swamp, a mire. We have to go. Break through. Take a risk. Better to die in battle like a soldier than to kick the bucket from fever in this god-forsaken hole. The idea was seductive. It appealed to the soldier's spirit, to the desire to act, not to hide. Billy, the youngest and most impatient, began to waver. He saw a twisted logic in Reg's words. The system Finch had created had saved them, but it had also imprisoned them. The conflict reached its peak one evening. They were sitting around the fire, and Reg decided to make his protest public. I think we should leave, he declared firmly, looking straight at Finch. Enough hiding like rats. We have to try to break through to our own. To who, Reg? Our own, Finch asked calmly, not taking his eyes off the mesmerizing dance of the flames. The army has been evacuated. France has capitulated. Out there on the coast there are only Germans. Do you want to be taken prisoner? And how would you know, Sergeant? Carter flared up. You got a radio? You getting reports? Maybe a new landing force has already arrived. Maybe the Americans have joined the war. We're sitting here in complete ignorance, and for all we know, the war's been over for ages. The war is not over, Owen Davis said quietly but forcefully, having been silent until then, whittling a piece of wood. I hear planes every day, and they're flying east, deeper into the country. That means the front has moved far from here. Old wives' tales, Reg exploded. I'm not going to follow orders that are leading us to our deaths anymore. Who's with me? Billy. The kid looked confusedly from Reg to Finch. He was scared and bewildered. A heavy, oppressive silence fell. The fate of their small unit hung in the balance. And then Finch stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He employed his surgical cruelty. He slowly walked over to Reg and looked him in the eyes. His gaze was as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. You want to go, Reg? Go, he said quietly, but in a way that made every word echo. I'm not keeping you. Your rifle, your knife. Here, take your share of food for 3 days. You won't last longer than that on your own anyway. But you're free. Reg was stunned. He had expected anything. An order, a fight, threats, but not this cold, indifferent permission. But alone, he stammered. I can't go alone. And you thought you would lead men? Finch's voice became even quieter, more dangerous. You thought I would let you lead this boy to his death because of your cowardice? You're no brave man, Reg. You're a coward. You're not afraid of the Germans. You're afraid of this silence. Afraid of being alone with your thoughts. That's why you need the noise, the fight, the risk, anything to keep from thinking. But we are here to survive. And your plan is certain, stupid death. So decide. Either you stay and you obey, or you leave right now. Alone. Finch turned and sat back down. It was a brilliant, ruthless psychological move. He hadn't suppressed the rebellion with force. He had exposed its true cause, existential fear, and laid it bare for all to see. Reg Carter stood in the middle of the camp, humiliated and crushed. He looked at Billy, seeking support, but the boy guiltily looked away. He looked at Owen, but the Welshman just slowly shook his head. He was alone. After a minute that felt like an eternity, Reg, without a word, picked up his rifle and sat down in the darkest corner of the dugout. The rebellion was crushed. Finch's law had prevailed. Their little empire had held. But while they were dealing with their internal strife, while they were licking their own wounds, they failed to notice that their true enemy, impersonal and merciless, was preparing its final devastating blow. The next day, when Tommy Glass went out on reconnaissance into a new, unexplored sector of the marsh, he did not return at the appointed time. The anxiety grew with each passing hour, like a slowly rising flood. Tommy Glass was punctual to the point of being obsessive. If he said he would be back by noon, he would be back at 12 sharp, not a minute sooner, not a minute later. Now the sun was already sinking towards the horizon, painting the sky and the surface of the marshes in bloody, alarming shades of red, and he was still not back. Finch paced their small camp, feeling a cold, heavy knot tightening inside him. He couldn't lose Tommy. The corporal wasn't just their cartographer. He was their brain, their hope for a meaningful survival, their compass in this chaos. Reg sat staring at a single point, his face ashen. He was tormented by guilt over the previous day's mutiny, which had undermined their unity and perhaps distracted them. Owen and Billy sat silently at the entrance to the dugout, peering into the reeds from where their comrade was supposed to appear. Finally, when it was almost dark, they heard him. It was not a shout, but rather a low, choked moan, like the cry of a wounded animal. They rushed towards the sound and found Tommy 100 meters, about 330 feet, from the camp. He was lying on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his face a grimace of unbearable pain. He had stepped into an old boar trap, overgrown with moss and grass, left here perhaps even before the war. The rusty steel teeth had clamped down on his shin, crushing the bone with a sickening crunch. This was the ultimate test, the emotional peak of their desperate struggle for life. Everything they had achieved, their shelter, their system, their fragile unity, was now on the line. A wounded man in their situation was a death sentence for the entire group. He couldn't walk. He would slow them down if they had to run. He required care and precious resources they barely had. The cold, ruthless logic of survival dictated only one most terrible solution: to leave him. Finch saw this thought in Reg's eyes. He felt it in Owen's tense silence, but he couldn't. He couldn't abandon his soldier, his comrade. He looked at Billy. The boy's eyes were filled with tears of horror and compassion. "We're not going to leave him, are we, Sergeant?" he whispered, his voice a plea. "No," Finch said firmly. "Never." They carried Tommy back to camp. His leg was a horrific sight of blood, mud, and bone fragments. Owen Davis, whose knowledge seemed limitless, took on the role of medic. He cleaned the wound with boiled water, using the last of their meager medical supplies. Then he did something that shocked the others. He pulled a red-hot knife from the fire. "We have to cauterize it," he said calmly, as if he were talking about fixing a tool. "Otherwise, infection will set in." "Hold him tight," Tommy screamed. His scream, full of inhuman agony, echoed across the quiet marsh. It was a sound that made the blood run cold and seemed to make the very trees weep. When it was over, he lost consciousness. No one slept that night. They sat around the wounded man, listening to his ragged, feverish breathing. Their little empire was crumbling. They were on the brink again. And it was at that moment that they were attacked. Not by Germans, not by beasts, but by a group of men. Ragged, feral, with eyes crazed by hunger. They were just like them, soldiers separated from their units who had long since crossed the line separating man from beast. Tommy's scream had drawn them in. They thought they had found easy prey. The fight was short, fierce, and almost silent. They fought with knives, entrenching tools, rifle butts. It wasn't a battle. It was a primeval slaughter in the dark. Finch fought with cold fury, putting all his hatred and despair into every blow. Owen, huge and silent, crushed enemies like a bear. Even Reg, forgetting his cynicism, fought like a lion, defending his home, his last refuge. But the hero of this fight was Billy Hobbs, the Kid Billy. When one of the attackers, the largest, broke through to the dugout where the helpless Tommy lay, Billy, without a second's thought, threw himself in his path. He was weaker and smaller, but a fierce determination burned in his eyes. He took the knife blow meant for his comrade. When it was over, and the attackers, leaving two breathless bodies on the ground, had vanished into the darkness, Finch ran to Billy. He was lying on the ground, clutching his hands to his chest, dark, thick blood seeping through his fingers. He was smiling, a weak, childish, almost apologetic smile. I didn't let them, Sergeant," he whispered. "I saved Tommy. Tell my mom." He didn't finish. This was the price of their victory, the price of their humanity. Billy was dying in his arms. And it was at that moment, in the deafening, ringing silence that followed the fight, that Reg Carter, who was on watch, let out a choked, hoarse cry. But it was not a cry of horror. It was a cry of amazement. He was pointing to the east. There, above the treetops, a tiny light of a signal flare was slowly rising into the sky. Red. Then another. And another. It was a signal. The signal they had been waiting for and had long since given up hope on. Somewhere out there were their own. The euphoria of rescue was short-lived and bitter. It was mixed with a thick, viscous grief. They buried Billy Hobbs on their little island under an old oak tree he had so loved. Owen carved his name and the date on the trunk. A simple, unmarked cross on an unmarked grave in the middle of the vast French marshes. That was all that remained of the 19-year-old boy who dreamed of being a hero and became one, though no one would ever know. The signal flares led them to a small group of the French resistance. They were local farmers and workers who had organized a partisan unit. They were met with suspicion, with a deep, ingrained distrust. 4 ragged, emaciated British soldiers with a severely wounded comrade on a makeshift stretcher aroused more suspicion than sympathy. Their leader, a stern, wiry man with a face like a baked apple and eyes that held no illusions, named Jean-Pierre, interrogated them at length. Finch's story of the blown bridge and the salvation of thousands of soldiers sounded like a fantasy novel, a tall tale. In the chaos of retreat and occupation, such stories were born by the dozen, and most were fabrications, a way to justify one's own flight or cowardice. "You say you blew up the bridge over the La Bassée?" Jean-Pierre squinted skeptically at Finch. "Strange. The Germans say it was destroyed by their own aircraft by mistake. That's the official report from the Kommandantur, the official report." Those words hit Finch like a slap in the face. Their heroic act, their sacrifice, the deaths of their comrades, all of it had been erased, rewritten, appropriated by the enemy. They weren't just forgotten. Their story had been stolen. Nevertheless, the French took them in. They were given food, real food, bread, cheese, and hot soup, the taste of which seemed divine. They were given clean clothes, and a veterinarian, the only medic in the unit, examined Tommy's leg. His verdict was grim: gangrene. It required immediate amputation, which was impossible to perform in field conditions. It required antibiotics, which they didn't have. Tommy's life hung by a thread. The collision with the wider world proved to be more terrifying for them than surviving in the marshes. There, in their dugout, they were masters of their own destiny. They had a system, laws, a clear purpose. Here they were nobodies again, pawns in someone else's incomprehensible game. They were suspected, interrogated, isolated from the other fighters. Their incredible survival experience, their unique skills were of no use to anyone. Moreover, they were dangerous. They were witnesses who knew too much. They were a living reproach to those who had fled and surrendered. Their story was an inconvenient truth that the system, even one as chaotic as the nascent resistance, instinctively tried to conceal or distort. Finch finally understood this when Jean-Pierre called him for a talk. "We can't keep you here, Sergeant," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It's too dangerous. The Germans have stepped up their searches in this area. We'll move you out one by one to different groups. It will be safer for everyone." "What about my wounded man?" Finch asked, feeling a chill inside. "We can't leave him." "I won't leave him. He will be taken care of," Jean-Pierre answered evasively. "We have connections. A doctor in the city. He will help." It was a lie. Finch could see it in the Frenchman's shifting eyes, in his false cheerfulness. A wounded Englishman was a burden to them, a deadly risk. His fate was sealed. Their brotherhood, forged in battle and survivor of the hellish marshes, was to be destroyed. Their story, their shared memory, torn to pieces. This was the final, most cruel blow. A blow delivered not by the enemy, but by those they considered allies. Later that evening, they came for them. They were separated. Finch was sent with one group, Owen with another, Reg with a third. They didn't even have time to say goodbye. The last thing Finch saw was the pale, tormented face of Tommy Glass being carried away by 2 Frenchmen in the opposite direction, and the despair in his eyes. The system had passed its verdict. Their fleet was buried alive. Their unit ceased to exist. Fate scattered them like autumn leaves caught in a merciless wind of war. Their shared story broke apart into 4 separate, tragic epilogues. Arthur Finch remained with the French resistance. His organizational skills and cold, almost inhuman determination found their use. He became a specialist in sabotage, once again blowing up bridges and derailing trains. He was effective, ruthless, and utterly silent. The French respected and slightly feared him. They called him l'Anglais tranquille, the quiet Englishman. He never told anyone about his unit, about the marshes, about the bridge. That memory became his private hell, his unhealing wound that he carried within him. After the liberation of France, he did not return to England. He couldn't. The world he had fought for seemed alien and false. He simply disappeared. It was said that he settled in a small village in the Pyrenees, far from people, spending the rest of his days making things in his carpentry workshop. He died in 1972 from a heart attack. A quiet, unnoticed end for a man whose decision had once changed the course of history. Owen Davis, the Welshman with golden hands and a poet's soul, also made it through the war with the partisans. But his heart did not harden. After the war, he returned to his native Wales, to his mine. But he could no longer go underground. The claustrophobia that had developed in the marshes and the cramped dugout never left him. He settled on a small farm and, until his old age, raised sheep and carved amazing wooden birds, which he gave to the village children. He rarely spoke of the war, but sometimes after a few pints of ale at the local pub, he would tell his grandchildren a strange fairy tale about 5 soldiers who lived on a magical island in the middle of a great swamp and built their own small but proud kingdom there. Reginald Carter, the cynic and rebel, found his element in the chaos and anarchy of partisan warfare. His distrust of everyone and everything saved his life more than once. He became a master of ambushes and raids, a daring and lucky fighter. His trail goes cold in 1944 during the fighting in Normandy. According to one version, he was killed after running into a German patrol. According to another, more plausible one, he simply deserted, taking the unit's cash box with him, and went to South America to start a new life. No one knows the truth. He left history just as he had lived, grumbling and without saying goodbye. The fate of Tommy Glass, the brilliant engineer, was the most tragic. The French had not lied when they said he would be taken care of. They did manage to get him to a doctor in an occupied city, risking their own lives. But it was too late. The gangrene had done its work. He died 2 days later, delirious, in a hospital bed far from his comrades. His last words, as an old French nurse later recounted, were something about maps, swamps, and an underwater bridge he had built to save his friends. He was buried in a mass grave in the city cemetery, without a name and without a cross. The brain of the unit, the man who had found their path to salvation, was the only one who never saw that salvation himself. And in the official archives of the British War Office, in a dusty folder labeled 302, concerning the losses of the Royal Engineers during the French campaign, there is still a short typewritten note. It lists 5 surnames: Sergeant Finch, A, Corporal Glass, T, Lance Corporal Davis, O, Private Carter, R, and Private Hobbs, W. Next to each of them is the same resolution: missing in action while performing a combat mission. Presumed killed. Their heroic act was officially erased. But, as the old folks in the villages around the Marais de Saint-Omer used to say, on a small, nameless island in the middle of the marshes under an old oak, a simple wooden cross could be seen for a long time. Who put it there? And in whose honor? No one knew. Thus ends the official story. 5 names on a list of casualties. A destroyed bridge attributed to an enemy aviation error. A few lines in a dusty archive. But real stories never die. They go underground, seep into the water, are passed on in whispers by fireplaces, transforming into something more than just a collection of facts. They become legends. The story of Sergeant Finch's unit was no exception. It didn't make it into the textbooks or the memoirs of generals, but it survived. It turned into a soldier's tale, told among the fighters of the French resistance. It was said that the swamps of Saint-Omer were haunted by the souls of 5 English soldiers, phantom engineers who could build a bridge from fog and guide lost partisans through the most impassable bogs. They became the guardian spirits of these places. This story became a legend among the locals. They said that sometimes on quiet moonlit nights, a soft weeping could be heard over the marshes. It was the young English soldier mourning his lost youth, and other times, a quiet, confident voice giving commands in a foreign tongue. It was their sergeant, who even after death, continues to look after his unit. Their feat, forgotten by grand history, achieved immortality in folklore. It became a symbol of the unbroken spirit, a reminder that even the smallest person, forgotten and betrayed by all, is capable of great deeds that can change the world, even if the world never finds out. This story is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a parable about how true heroism is often anonymous, how the greatest victory can turn into a crushing defeat, and how human memory is a strange and selective thing. It discards the loud names and parade reports, but carefully preserves the quiet, almost unheard stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The story of the 5 sappers who blew up a bridge and locked themselves in hell is one of them. It is a reminder that beneath every line of the official war chronicles lie thousands of such forgotten tragedies and unnoticed feats. And it is our duty to remember them, to remember those whose names have been erased, but whose deeds are forever woven into the fabric of our shared history.